It's time to focus on today's educational issues. Issues that affect you, your kids, community, and your tax dollars. Topics like violence, legislation, special needs, the gifted, curriculum, technology, the parent's role, building self-esteem, and minorities' needs. How do we deal with substance abuse, AIDS, sports, and very importantly, funding?
Welcome to School Talk. I'm Nadja Varney, your host. Balance is so important in the lives of our children. For years, when I conducted workshops on reading, one of the things that we focused on was readiness, to keep that balance between challenge and frustration. But today, many people say our children are stressed out. There is no balance. Today, we're going to find out, is that true, and what can we do about it if it is? I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Brooks, psychologist, author, producer of TV and radio spots, and a much sought-after lecturer, workshop leader in the United States and now in other parts of the world. So I'm delighted to welcome an old friend of School Talk, Dr. Robert Brooks. Welcome, Bob.
It's always a pleasure to be here and hear those lovely introductions.
Well, you deserve them, and I know how long it takes us to get you here with your busy itinerary. But in this world right now, it seems to me to have become a culture of extremes. Extreme sports, the video games pressed toward the extreme. It seems to me almost impossible to talk about even balance. So for this discussion, would you, before we start, talk about how you would define what do you see as balance, and what's feeding this frenzy away from balance toward these extremes?
Yeah. Well, for me, and everyone may have a different definition, balance is balancing certain demands, like for a child, school, social demands, sports, and also balance for me involves just being able to relax. One of the things I talk about with parents is take a helicopter view of your child's life so you can see the whole terrain of their life. How much time do they spend in physical activities? How much time in academic activities? How much time in social activities? Are they spending too much time in front of the computer or playing video games? How much time do you spend as a family? And although it may differ from one family to the next, what is the best balance? Certainly, if it's skewed toward one thing more than another, like a family spending very little time together or a child being at the computer playing video games for 6 hours a day, then it's very obvious that things have to be put in a greater balance. Because if not, the child's development is not going to take place in the most appropriate ways.
Well, what do you think, though, is feeding this, well, I call it a frenzy, because you see this now with young people, even the children, it's called extreme, that with the big X on it. Where is this coming from?
Well, it's not to blame just technology, but certainly technology plays a part. Kids from a very early age are bombarded with video games, with computers, and there's nothing wrong with computers. I use it, a lot myself. But I think we're in a society where everything is fast food. Everything has to be done here and now. And some experts are really concerned that children are being robbed of the opportunity to reflect on things, to just have fun, to learn how to solve problems, and it's just being bombarded then by these stimuli. And as I say, experts are concerned about what does that even mean for the development of the brain and for the processing of information.
I'm so glad you started there, because with your words, development of the brain, leads me to my next question about who's responsible and when does that responsibility kick in for helping kids find balance. I read an article by Dr. Walter Gilliam. He's an associate scientist at the Yale University Child Study Center. And he was pointing out from his research that preschoolers are being expelled from preschool for behavior problems at a higher rate now than K through 12. That seems like such a reverse. So who's responsible now for finding balance? It sounds like we need earlier and earlier attention.
Well, the first responsibility, I feel, are the parents. They're the first educators, the first teachers, and whatever. But part of the problem is many parents haven't found balance in their lives. Our schedules are so hectic. In most families, both parents work, so parents really have to find a certain balance. If you're leading a frenetic life, it's difficult to help your child to be more balanced. But I think what we also have to look at is then when a child enters school, what are the expectations there for that child? Do you build in more physical activity? I've been at some schools where I've been surprised that there's not enough physical activity. I went to one school where it was great. The teacher started the class by having the kids actually do deep breathing. It might seem almost funny,
No, it's
but
good.
she said kids have to be, in one sense, more relaxed to be able to be more receptive to learning. So, and she was very aware of the physical activity that had to be built in, the quiet time that had to be built in. And what impressed me when I visited a few classes like that, even so-called hyperactive kids could learn to relax. You know, sometimes people say, well, they're going to be all over the place. But it was very interesting to see that you can set up a classroom environment where kids can be then much more relaxed, leading a more balanced life, being more receptive to learning. But I think it really has to start, of course, at the home, and then teachers and parents working very closely together to look at the child's overall development.
I love that, what you just said, because you always affirm me. You know, I was not in the classroom for all of my career, but for part of it. And I used to start my first and second grade out. I have a little piano that, you know, an electric keyboard, and you can put it on a rhythm. So I would let one of the children select the rhythm, whether it was from South America or Africa or America. And we started our day with rhythms, and whatever the leader did, we all copied. It was kind of half dancing and half phys ed. And I got the boys involved by telling them, oh, I noticed the athletes really know how to stay in rhythm, you know. So you always come and affirm, because nobody ever affirms teachers very much.
Well,
so
I'll affirm what you...
Well, I hope all our viewers are listening and saying it's okay to be a little non-traditional. Dr. Brooks is pointing out how important these
Well, it's
things
even
are.
when I give a workshop, I like to tell some funny story. I want people to feel relaxed right away. I'm always asking, how can I help this group, who may not be moving that much for the next hour or so, feel more relaxed, feel more receptive to learning, involve their thinking. That's why I like to pose questions for them to think about. I like to have some humorous stories, because humor helps us to be more relaxed and more receptive to learning.
I think it's the Bible that says laughter is a good medicine or something like
Yes.
that. You write in some of your articles about pressurized children, which to me sounds like somebody off balance. What do you mean by the pressurized children?
Years ago, David Elkind wrote a wonderful book, The Hurry Child, where he said we are rushing our children to grow up too quickly. But in my clinical practice, I just took that term, and in several of my workshops and writings, I call it the pressurized child. And what I meant by that is, some kids I have worked with, and teachers report this, parents, that they always seem under pressure. They are not relaxed. Part of it may be that, you know, they have a certain temperament, which they're more predisposed to feeling pressure. But the reality is, even at a young age, some of these kids, I've spoken to kids 7 years old who are already worried about getting into college.
Oh, my.
Well, but I've spoken to parents who say to me, if my kid doesn't go to this preschool, then they may not be able to go here or here. And it's like their whole future is already being determined by the time they're 3 or 4. And also, some kids pick up on the pressure of the parents. Parents, I start with the assumption of very well-meaning, but some parents have kids involved in far too many activities. Some parents are trying to live their life through the child so that they want to see their child be straight A, be the best athlete, and whatever. And what happens is there's almost no time for the child to relax. Some children feel it's conditional love. I'm only loved if I'm involved in these kinds of activities and am very successful. And so we really have to help children to just, I'll say it, to relax, to have fun. But we have to help whole families do that. I always say classrooms should be playful places. Homes should be playful places where people can just stretch out and relax. And I'm telling you, a lot of families, even though they say that's important, they really don't build it in.
Yeah. Well, that's so important. Maybe you could give us a few examples of how parents, you know, maybe you could take one area or so, and just how can parents help decompress them, as you say in your articles?
Well, one thing that's very important, when I wrote Raising Resilient Children, I felt this, it was very important. A lot of the examples in that book were parents who had placed really overly high expectations on children and high demand. So I think what parents have to do is be very realistic in your expectations for children. Another thing is to look at your family. Do you have time, just as I said before? Do you play games with your kids? I don't mean video games, but just sit there and play games. Do you go for a walk? Do you just toss a ball in the, in your neighborhood? I remember some of my fondest moments with when my two sons were growing up. We had a back field behind our house. Just taking a football and tossing it back and forth. An hour could go by. It was relaxing, and then often I would go and tackle them, and in that fatherly way where you show your love. And just laying on the floor with your kids. Or when they're young, reading to them, which sometimes we don't do as much anymore, but turn reading into really a lovely activity by engaging the child in their own fantasies, by saying, I wonder what'll happen to this character in the story. What do you think will happen? So you're enjoying the reading, but you're also engaging the child in reflecting and thinking.
Is it Gilliam who wrote something called, I won't get it correct, but that little poem that says something like, caskets of treasures and caskets of jewels, but richer than I, you will never be. I had a mother who read to me. Something like that.
Oh, I don't know who said it, but I've heard
You've
that.
heard that,
yes.
yes. And so what you're saying, those memories and the relationship, and you can't really be too uptight when you're just reading a story and talking back and forth. Now, that's fine at home, but now you have 20 children sitting in front of you, and I can just hear teachers saying, look, how can I decompress these kids when there's so much pressure now? They have high-stakes testing. So maybe you could give some examples for a teacher, how she or he might decompress.
Right. It's so interesting you say that. One of my most requested themes for teachers lately has been how to help teachers deal with their own stress and become what they call stress hardy. Look, teachers have such an impact on kids in such a wonderful way, and if they're stressed, it's of course more difficult to help kids decompress. But there are several things. One has to ask, again, what is it that will help kids decompress? What are the pressures kids feel? As I mentioned before, some teachers even build in, let's have 30 seconds just to relax. One of the biggest pressures for kids is the fear of failure and making mistakes. One of the exercises I talk a lot about in my book, The Self-Esteem Teacher, is how to create a classroom environment where kids are not concerned about making a mistake and being humiliated. One of the greatest pressures in a classroom, which people often do not discuss, is the fear of humiliation if you make a mistake. And there are specific activities that teachers could do. And just have fun with the kids. One of my strictest teachers, Mr. Minato, my 6th grade teacher, was also, Nadja, one of the most playful.
Isn't that something?
He was just playful, and I remember, I loved it. I loved it. I felt so relaxed in his classroom, even though he was one of the most demanding and challenging, which shows that you can be playful and you can still have expectations for kids to learn and to be accountable and responsible for their own behavior.
It sounds so much like what I've seen you do with workshops and how you treat people, whether it's our staff here, but that sense of respect. And I think that builds self-esteem. And so when we come back, we're going to take a break.
Okay.
One of your earlier favorite themes, self-esteem, is now being criticized. So when we come back, I'd like to talk about that. Stay with us. How important is your self-esteem?
Mr. Buffundo, the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, Ed, our company's new president.
Wow. That reminds me of how President William Henry Harrison, 9th American president, caught a cold on Inauguration Day. 31 days later, boom, dead. Yeah, completely dead. 6 feet under.
It's fun to know history. Find curious facts from America's past at loc.gov, the Library of Congress website.
Dr. Brooks, I know, especially earlier, I used to call you the guru of self-esteem and read your books that promoted it. I felt in the proper way. But recently, there's been criticism of this whole idea of focusing on self-esteem. And Dr. Robert Epstein, who writes in Psychology Today, I'll just read you his quote, and then maybe you could respond to it. Hundreds of studies, Dr. Epstein says, have failed to show that self-esteem training produces lasting positive results. To put this another way, merely feeling good about yourself doesn't necessarily make you more effective. What's more, recent studies suggest that self-esteem training may be harmful, that it leads many students to overestimate their abilities. Well, how important is self-esteem?
Well, I think it's important, but I think what you're capturing there is something I believe very strongly in. It's not training. You know, one of my books was The Self-Esteem Teacher, and in that book, what I tried to do is articulate what helps a child to be more confident and have higher self-esteem. But what I looked at in terms of self-esteem was realistic achievement, self-discipline, accountability, responsibility. There was what they called the self-esteem movement, which many of these studies were based on, which really well-meaning people went astray. They thought all you have to say to a child is, you know, feel wonderful, and the kid is going to feel wonderful. Or they would have activities. I visited classrooms. I am special. Well, the reality is kids do not feel special unless you treat them that way and provide them with opportunities to really shine, to be successful, to be compassionate. One of the most important things I have learned in some of my research about high self-esteem is when you give to others. Not when you say, I'm wonderful, but you say, because I'm on this earth may be a better place because I can help other people. So these studies really suggest to me that you don't train someone to have high self-esteem. What you do is provide opportunities where they will feel more comfortable, more responsible, more accountable, more disciplined, and more compassionate. And I don't mean these just as words, because in my writings I really tried to articulate how you develop this attitude in people. And that's why I basically even started to move away from the concept of self-esteem with the more overriding concept of resilience. What helps people to be more hopeful and optimistic and resilient? Dignity, self-esteem is one part of it, but it's just one part.
I've talked with you before about this on the air and off, and I've always been impressed that you're not talking about narcissism and self-love. You've never put that across, so I was so glad for you to straighten this out, because in a popular magazine, again, people can go astray and miss the real point. You just mentioned resiliency, and of course for balance, we are like on a seesaw looking for that homeostasis or whatever it is, up and down. What is it that helps some children be more resilient and they bounce back, as you say, and others don't?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. First of all, there's research to show some children from birth will have an easier time being resilient, leading a balanced life based on their temperament. But that's just part of it. Then it's the household they grow up in, the expectations that are there, and it gets back to what we were talking about before. Do they experience in their household unconditional love, so they feel totally accepted? Do parents focus a lot on what I call their strengths or islands of competence? Do parents help kids learn how to solve problems and not just solve it for them? Because one of the most important things in resilience is when problems arise, you feel you have the ability to sit back, to think about different solutions and to try different solutions rather than to just act impulsively. Do parents help kids to develop self-discipline, which is one of the most important aspects of resilience? If a person acts before they think, it's very hard for them to be resilient. And do parents help kids learn how to deal with frustrations and obstacles in ways where they really are teachable moments and not times where you criticize or accuse your child?
You just mentioned a phrase that I recall reading in your works before, and I think it could use some elaboration. You call them islands of competence. Now, children have islands of competence. I love that phrase. I think I know what you mean, but would you talk a little bit about that, if that helps find their balance?
No, well, I think it's critical, to find their balance. The reason I first used that image or metaphor years ago was working with a lot of kids and adults who really did not feel very highly about themselves. I had this image one day that many of them seemed to be drowning in an ocean of inadequacy. And it was just this image. I said, if there are oceans of inadequacy, there must be islands of competence or areas of strength. And so what I started to do in my clinical practice, instead of just focusing on what's wrong with this kid or what's wrong with this adult, I started actually asking parents, would you please tell me what you see as your child's strengths or islands of competence? When I go in and work with teachers, what do you see as this kid's islands of competence? When I work with adults, what do you see as your strengths or islands of competence? Because if you just focus on what you can't do very effectively and not what your strengths are, then you're going to become very depressed. And what I always say is, the more you can identify and reinforce the islands of competence of children and your own, the more then you're going to feel much better and much more self-assured, and you're going to be more resilient. It's hard to be resilient if you walk around feeling, I have no strengths at all.
Mm-hmm. And I can see where both parents and teachers can really impact and influence that child's sense of balance and self-esteem. You write also about, in the same area of resiliency, about having a resilient mindset. Mm-hmm. Now, you can speak to that either for the parent, the teacher, or a child, but what do you mean by having I think you called it a resilient mindset?
Yeah. In some books I've written with Sam Goldstein, what we asked was this question: how do resilient people see the world differently from those who are not? How do they view others? How do they view themselves? And what we started saying is it's really a mindset, certain assumptions or expectations you have for yourself and others. And so what we tried to do was to articulate what are these assumptions, what are the expectations. They're part of a mindset. So there are things like the belief that others are available to be of assistance when you need them, the belief that mistakes are experiences from which to learn, the belief that when you are successful, it is based on your own resources, so you can take some realistic credit, not narcissistic credit, but realistic credit. Mm-hmm. The belief that when problems come up, you can solve them. Why we wanted to articulate this is, if you know what those characteristics are, every interaction a teacher or a parent has with a child, they can also ask, am I strengthening a resilient mindset? But when we wrote our book, The Power of Resilience, which focuses on resilience in adults, we say the same thing. The more an adult understands what are the characteristics of optimistic, hopeful people, the more they can try to strengthen that in themselves.
Mm-hmm. You just listed so beautifully several of the factors that go into having a resilient mindset. Could you pick one that you think parents, well, they're all very important, but maybe you could just take one and either give an example of how parents could actually help the child achieve that mindset?
Well, one of the most important that people are looking at is the whole issue of problem solving, learning to think before you act. So let's take a child who's having a fight with a neighbor's kid. The parent stops the fight, that's good, but some parents will say, and if you do that again next time, I'm really going to get very upset with you, on and on. But what now experts in the field of problem solving would say, instead of screaming or yelling, which may seem obviously that something you shouldn't do, what you would say to the child is, what is it that you can do differently next time? In a classroom, if there's some difficulty in a classroom, there's bullying or teasing, the teacher, instead of just telling them kids what to do, it's much more effective if the teacher says, what do you think will work? What you want to do is empower the child or the children to have a sense of ownership for solving problems. Imagine it this way. As an adult, if any time a problem came up, you said to yourself, I don't even know where to start. Do you know how overwhelming that is? And you can't be resilient. But as an adult, when problems come up, if you can say, okay, let me step back, what are possible solutions to this? What should I try? What have I learned from the past? Then you feel much more confident, and the solutions you're going to arrive at are going to really be based on previous experiences in which you were successful.
Mm-hmm. This is so important, it seems to me, and so basic, foundational to learning as well as achievement in life, as well as in school. I wonder if you could just speak to this whole idea of these high-stakes testing, how we can say to a child, help them have a resilient mindset going into this kind of really focused testing that they, I know not to take a long time on it, but it seems very important.
I could spend hours. I mean, I believe testing is important to assess things. I really have major questions about one test determining graduation, what we call high-stakes testing. And, you know, there are now a lot of people who are really questioning not assessment, but high-stakes testing. It's tough to say to a kid who's going in and knows whether he or she is going to graduate is going to be based on the result of this test, don't worry, it's just one test. Because it's more than just one test. So I think as a society, we have to look for and continue to refine, how are we assessing progress in kids? How are we assessing whether kids are ready for graduation? And again, I could spend hours on this. I have some feelings about one test being the determinant, and some states it is, of whether or not a kid is going to graduate. And I think we have to look very carefully then, if we're going to have high-stakes testing, how will we prepare kids? Are we testing the whole child? You know, Howard Gardner years ago said there are multiple intelligences, and some, but most tests measure mathematical, logical skills or verbal skills. Well, some kids, that's not their islands of competence.
Well, before we run out of our last few minutes,
Okay.
I do want to know, thank you so much for speaking to that. You travel a great deal, and you speak to all kinds of groups. What keeps you, what do you see or sense in your travels with teachers and parents that keeps you so optimistic about children will find balance?
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the most requested talks, and this is what helps me to be a little more optimistic, I'm asked to give is now on optimism and resilience and what helps kids to deal with stress, what helps us to deal with stress. So at least it's out there, at least people are thinking about it. On the other side, I get concerned because everyone is, you know, so busy in today's world. You almost feel like saying, slow down. Enjoy the moment. You know, the book, The Precious Moment. Enjoy what's happening right now. And I don't want it to sound just like a slogan, but so there's the optimism that people are more aware of it. But the next step has to be that each family has to take responsibility for developing, you know, an environment where there is some fun, relaxation, and not this great pressure to be involved in 20 activities, to have straight A's, to be the superstar in every sport.
And as you know, my husband passed away when he was very young, and my children
Right.
were 4 and 5. And so I've always been teaching or working outside the home. But there was always time to play, and to play the piano and march or giggle and tickle and all those wonderful things that just keep it light, right?
I totally agree.
Yeah.
You can do it. Someone said to me, it's hard work. I said, it is. What's the alternative? To continue to be stressed out?
True. Well, thank you ever so much. We've kind of come to the end of our show, but I think maybe we should have you back if you can ever find another day in all your itinerary to come
Well,
back
thank
to
you so
School
much,
Talk.
Nadja. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. In closing, in one of Dr. Brooks's articles, he refers to an article in the Boston Globe written by T. Robertson. And the headline is as follows: the whistles blow for alpha families to call a timeout. Some wonder if our youths are driven too hard. I'm going to say that again. Some wonder if our youths are driven too hard. Time out. Time out to reflect, to grow. That's also the mission of School Talk.